Two presidents are going to get together in the near future, Trump and Putin, and sit down and even walk around. But what are they going to talk about? More importantly, what does Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and Scott Ott think they should talk about? On this episode of Right Angle, we'll break that open. Since we don't really know what's going to happen, and probably after it's happened, guys, we won't know what has happened. Because like he did with President Kim in the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, he plans to spend a little bit of one-on-one time, my understanding is, with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. And so since we don't have real insight into what will happen or what does happen, I'd like to talk about what should happen. Gentlemen, in our backstage episode, we discussed the idea of, under previous administrations, you knew what was going to be the big issue on the table. You know, with Reagan, it was going to be nuclear weapons. With George W. Bush, it would have probably been a discussion of America's moral leadership and how the Russians ought to be more like us, and we would be lecturing them, or at least this is the idea in the popular mind. Under Barack Obama, maybe a discussion of Ukraine would have been fruitful at that point. Now, under President Trump, it seems like the most important thing to the American news media is whether and how the Russians manipulated the election result, of course, producing a President Trump. Stephen Green, what would you like to see President Donald Trump bring up with Vladimir Putin, and what do you think would be kind of your dream outcome of this summit?
Oh boy, that's a big question. To get there, let me give you a little history lesson. For all his flaws, and there were many, George H.W. Bush was the exact right president to have on hand, once Reagan was out of office, during the fall of the Soviet Union, because he wasn't an in-your-face guy. He was kind of a crisis management guy, and he did a very good job of letting the Soviet Union fall gracefully without a shooting war. I don't think we've ever seen that big an empire fall that quickly and that peacefully. And I think Bush's management technique had a lot to do with that. Some of us at the time were like, oh man, you got to go to Kiev and tell the Ukrainians to assert their independence, right? It's a good way to start a war. We don't want to do that. Instead, he managed the decline gracefully, and that's how it went off without a hitch. That was a great thing. Since then, we've gotten every single thing wrong with Russia. I mean, there's not one damn thing we've done right. I'm not letting the Russians off scot-free on this one either. They have used our mistakes to gin up nationalism and paranoia as an excuse to do all kinds of things. But the fact remains that we've screwed just everything up. Clinton sent those advisors over in the 1990s who, instead of teaching them how to create rule of law and other little Western niceties, instead taught them how to best exploit resources and command the economy from these oligarchs. And then Bush was kind of, as you said, the second Bush was all about showing how morally superior we were. Oh, and I didn't even talk about NATO. This was the biggest blunder of all. I won't just skip the Obama stuff and the Bush stuff. Let's talk about NATO. When the Warsaw Pact fell, NATO should have thrown itself the biggest victory party in history, given ourselves a nice pat on the back, and then disbanded. You don't need a defensive alliance when there's no bad guy, when there's no enemy. And instead of doing that, we kept NATO, and we didn't just keep it, we expanded it right up to the border of the old Soviet Union, and in the case of the Baltic states, right inside the Soviet Union, and by the way, with no actual plan to defend any of these countries. So we enhanced Russian paranoia while sort of asserting Western weakness and fecklessness. It was just the dumbest thing in the world. I mean, we can't back out now because we've been doing this for 20, 25 years. We're kind of stuck with it, but just huge mistakes all the way through. And now we have all these little tiny problems with Russia. Well, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but we've got a lot of them. And Dwight Eisenhower liked to say that when a problem seems too big, enlarge it. That is to look at a bigger picture. And so we have all these various problems with Russia. What we need to do is instead of taking on Crimea as an issue, or Russian exploitation in Georgia as another issue, or this or that, is maybe to step back, encourage Putin to step back, and encourage us to step back and look at the much bigger picture. And that is, Russia should be a part of the West. both have the same problems with China. We have the same problems with radical Islam. We have a lot more in common than we have separating us. And what I would like Trump to do is to actually step back and look at the bigger picture with Putin and find those areas where we can cooperate, because I would love to welcome Russia fully into the Western world, and I think they could be an important part of it.
Yeah, Bill Whittle, I mean, what Stephen Green is saying there sounds lovely, except when you consider that Vladimir Putin, the former head of their intelligence arm, who has the blood of probably American spies on his hands, who is in effect a democratic dictator going through, election processes that look nominally free and open, but in fact always result in him getting elected long past whatever anybody would expect from a democratic Republican form of government, so to speak. How can we even sit down with this guy? I mean, the same question comes up here that did with Kim Jong-un. Isn't President Trump sitting down with this guy, essentially bringing legitimacy to that corruption in his own country? And also, gee, Bill, the Mueller investigation is still going on right now. And the accusation is that Trump colluded with Putin to win the election. And now he's going to go over and rub noses with him. What should Trump do in this setting?
Let me just address the Russian influence in the election thing first. I don't believe it's true, but let's just assume it is. Who's responsible for allowing a foreign power to have that kind of influence in American politics? I would say it would be the responsibility of the FBI under the Obama administration. That's what I would say. But I think the FBI was a little bit too busy making sure that Hillary Clinton got elected. And so the entire idea of whether or not Trump colluded with the Russians, let me rephrase that, whether the Russians influenced the American election. If the Russians influenced the American election, it is a monumental failure of the intelligence and counterintelligence services of the United States of America under the Obama administration. So that's where the blame for that lies if it happened, and I don't particularly think that it did. They're trying to influence elections all the time, and so are we. If it actually succeeds, then your country's got a problem. Here's the thing about Putin. I don't want to say I have mixed feelings about him. I think he's a very evil man. I think he's not just American spies' blood on his hands. There's a lot of Russian blood on his hands too. Some fairly compelling evidence. He ordered somebody to use nerve gas to kill a dissident in a park in London, which got them a whole new round of sanctions. So let me be crystal clear on this. I do not consider this guy to be a friend. I don't think he's an admirable person, but there are qualities in him that I do admire, only because I admire them because they're qualities that I have myself. Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia because he was determined and has, in fact, decided to make Russia great again. I mean, that's the entire reason that Putin is there. He took a country, and I know this having been married to a Russian wife now for a year and a half and having known her for 2 years. Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, was a laughingstock. I mean, people would just simply openly mock him at trade meetings like the G8 and so on. And Russia would just be laughed at. And for people that used to be the other superpower, the other pole of the world for 50, 60 years, that was harsh. So anybody who understands the Make America Great Again thing can at least understand, I think, the motivation that Putin carries as his primary motivation and why that appeals to the Russian people. My wife actually, I thought, just completely nailed it when I was talking about Putin. She said, "Oh, Putin loves Russia. It's the Russian people he doesn't care about." And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So a person who wants to make his country strong and who's a patriot, I respect and I understand. I think that we hear so much about sanctions, Scott. We're going to issue sanctions. And in America, I've always come to think of sanctions just a joke. It's like our sternly worded letter. But having lived with somebody who lived under those sanctions have really, really, really destroyed the Russian economy. Restaurants close, advertising agencies, all these things close. We applied those sanctions because in 2008, Vladimir Putin took armed forces into Georgia. And then he took them into the Ukraine, then he took them into Crimea, fostered rebellions and so on. I'm convinced he did these things because he knew he could get away with it. And the reason he knew he could get away with it because he knew who was president of the United States at that time. When Donald Trump, on his second day in office, drops the biggest non-nuclear weapon in the inventory, that is a statement. And that, I think, has basically made it clear to Putin that this is not the same game. So this is just another example, Scotty, of the lesson that seems never to be learned by the left, that expansionist powers, non-democratic powers, will do whatever they can to get away with whatever they can, and they're constrained only by the will and the armed might of good people who live in democracies. I think Donald Trump is going to take an opportunity to explain that to him, but I don't think that he needs to explain it to him. I think Putin already has that lesson. So whether Putin likes Trump or admires Trump is irrelevant. I suspect he fears Trump more than he feared Obama. In fact, I don't see how it could be anybody feared less than Obama as president of the United States. So I suspect Russians' behavior will be better, and it would be nice, I think, to see the same sort of result as we got with Korea. We tried nothing but carrot, and then we tried nothing but stick. So now why don't we try them both and stick first?
And I think that that both of you, I think, have flanked this issue very well, or framed this issue very well. And the way I see Donald Trump's international efforts are not so much as an expression or an advancement of sort of American hegemony or our values or our politics or our Constitution, trying to extend that to the world. I think Donald Trump really sees the elixir of freedom to be business. And I think that he wants to bring that to, it's like when he showed Kim the video of, hey, by the way, this is what North Korea could look like if you had resorts up and down the coastline and speedboats hopping along the waves, and, and the lights were lighting up, and, you actually had a functioning electrical power grid. And I think what is amazing to anybody who's lived through this period of time, from the Reagan years on to today, is the different way we view Russia now than we did then. I mean, there's nobody in this country now who's really afraid that Russia is going to launch a nuclear weapon, when back then everybody thought that was a pretty likely event.
I didn't think we'd get out of the 70s or the 80s. I really did not think I'd live to be 20.
So we've got a whole different perspective now, and I think if you're able to look at things in the vast scope of sort of apparatchik time, to be able to view this and say, you know what, this is pretty amazing. This is pretty amazing that a U.S. president is going over there and dealing man-to-man with a Russian president, unintimidated by him, not prone to cough up concessions, but also not prone to really lecture him either. Not worried about a Russian attack, and probably more than anything, he's going to do what he did with Kim, which is invite Russia to step further into the civilized world. It's still a marvel that this great nation with this massive land mass and this brilliant people has yet to really produce any great products that have been spread around the world, or at least not on the consumer level that that we're aware of. Yeah. And so I think nothing but good can come of the opportunity to have new markets opened for American goods, as well as and people who are reborn to the spirit of entrepreneurism and innovation that could be unleashed when these people come out from under this darkness that they've been emerging from for the past 30 years or so. So I'm actually very encouraged. I like when President Trump has these kind of meetings. I think you're always better off. At least if the guy's an adversary, I want to know him. I want to take the measure of the man. I want to get nose to nose. And I'm not necessarily going to think that, like George W. Bush reportedly said, I've looked into his soul. I think that Vladimir Putin has been pretty good at concealing his soul, if indeed he has one. And so that's not what I'm looking for. But I think you gather better intelligence given the opportunity by walking in the front door, shaking the guy's hand, sitting down with him, and listening to how he thinks. So all the best to President Trump in this encounter. I am encouraged by this, as I was with the North Korean venture, and we'll see how it plays out. But I don't think we'll ever fully know what happens there. However, I think we're on a good trajectory with the Trump foreign policy so far, and I want to see more of it. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.